We take shadows for granted. They're the quiet proof that something exists, attached to us by light, bending and stretching in predictable ways. They trail us on sunny sidewalks, mimic our gestures on dimly lit walls, flicker beside us when we move past car headlights. Shadows are harmless because they behave. They follow rules. They belong to something, but some don't. It often starts with something small. A strange shape cast against a wall that doesn't match anything nearby. A silhouette out of place. At first, you might blame a trick of the light. A reflection off glass, an optical illusion. You move, and it doesn't. You check behind you and there's nothing there. No one standing, no object to cast it. Just the shape. Still, unchanging. You leave. You tell yourself it was nothing. Your eyes were tired. The room was oddly lit. Maybe you imagined it, until it happens again. And this time, it's not in the same place. It's in your hallway, in your stairwell. It appears briefly at the edge of your vision when you turn off the lights at night. A bend in the darkness, a form without mass. Not menacing, not aggressive, just still, watching, always a few feet away, never moving when you're looking, never gone when you're not. That's when the unease begins to settle. Not because it's chasing you, but because it seems to know where you'll be. It's already there. Not ahead in a timeline sense, but ahead in intention. It appears in places you were just thinking of walking into, near doors you haven't yet opened, in rooms you're about to enter. People who've encountered it describe the same eerie detail. It doesn't behave like a shadow. It doesn't stretch. It doesn't flicker. It stays perfectly still, even as light shifts around it, as if it isn't reacting to the world, but watching it. And you. You begin to notice it more often. It doesn't matter where you are, at a gas station late at night, in your office after hours, on a quiet street corner with no foot traffic. It's there, on the pavement, on the wall, on the floor beneath the flickering light. A silhouette in a posture you've come to recognize. Slightly hunched, head tilted, legs poised as if waiting to step forward, but never does. Some say it's harmless, that it never touches, never speaks, that if you ignore it long enough, it fades. But others know better. They say the moment you stop, truly stop, something changes. That the stillness isn't patience, it's preparation. Because it's not following you, it's waiting for you to give up, to sit down, to stand still, to stop moving long enough for it to reach you. Welcome to Tales from the Forbidden Library, where stories linger like dust in sealed rooms, and shadows stretch longer than they should. This is not a tale of pursuit. It's a tale of what happens when you finally stop running. The earliest recorded accounts don't come from paranormal investigators or urban legend forums. They come from cleaning staff, overnight workers, and security guards. People who spend long hours in empty buildings, walking halls meant to be still. A janitor at a closed-down theater in southern Italy reported seeing the same shadow every night on the stage floor, even when no one else was present. He tried everything, adjusting lights, switching positions, even calling a friend to stand where the shadow appeared. Nothing worked. The shape didn't match his or anyone's. It was simply there, and always in the same place. In 1978, a hospital night nurse in Reykjavik filed an internal report after she witnessed a figure-shaped shadow on the wall of an empty patient room. No one had been assigned to the room in weeks. She described the shadow as unnaturally still, even when light from the hallway should have shifted it. When she stepped inside, it vanished. But the next night, it returned. Same posture, same spot. Within days, she began feeling drained, disoriented. She requested a transfer. Her request was denied. She resigned a week later, but the file remains archived in the hospital's own internal oddities drawer. Every hospital has one. Stories like this began to accumulate. whispered between people who had no reason to lie and every reason not to be believed. A subway operator in Seoul reported a shadow that stood on the opposite platform every night, never catching a train, never moving. Security footage confirmed there was no one there, yet the shadow could be seen when the operator glanced up at the reflective glass. It only disappeared once the train began moving again, never before. Then came the reports from private homes. People described shapes appearing on their bedroom walls, always after midnight, always when the room was still. They'd be reading or watching TV, then feel a presence. Turning toward the wall, they'd see a shadow as if someone stood between them and the lamp. But there was no one there. The door was closed, the window sealed, and the outline was wrong. Too long in the arms, too narrow at the neck, as if the figure casting it wasn't shaped quite like us. What made it worse was the consistency. The outline appeared the same across continents, the same angle of the head tilt, the same slightly slouched posture. Witnesses who had never met gave identical descriptions. Some even drew sketches, and the drawings matched nearly perfectly. That's when fringe researchers began taking notice. It wasn't just that the shadow didn't belong to a person, it's that it always seemed to anticipate where the person would be next. One particularly disturbing account came from a man in Toronto who noticed the shadow on a tree outside his apartment. He lived alone. The tree was across the street, yet the shadow was cast on his window. When he went downstairs to investigate, he found no one outside, but when he looked back up, the shadow was gone. He returned to his apartment, sat down, and saw it again. Not on the window this time, but on the wall behind him. He never turned around. Some who've seen it once are never bothered again. They go on with their lives, shaken but untouched. But others, especially those who looked too long or tried to speak to it, began seeing it more frequently, in new places, new angles, as if noticing it had somehow given it permission to stay close. A pattern began to form. The shadow never approached, never attacked. It simply reappeared, closer, not dramatically so, just enough to make you question your memory, just enough to make you feel watched, and always in places of stillness, moments when you'd stop to rest, to think, to let your guard down. It doesn't want to chase you. It wants you to stop walking, because when you do, you'll realize something chilling. The shadow isn't copying you. It's waiting for you to finally match its shape. One of the most unsettling realizations about the shadow is that it doesn't move in the way you'd expect. In every account, across countries, cultures, and decades, it is never seen shifting, crawling, or drifting. It simply relocates, appearing where it should not be, positioned where you are going to be, as though it navigates not by space, but by intention. You think of the hallway, there it is. You glance at the kitchen, there. You hesitate before opening a door and find it already waiting behind the glass pane. This behavior has led some to believe it isn't following at all. It doesn't care where you've been. It cares where you will be. And it doesn't seem bound to your pace, your path, or your schedule. It exists just ahead of your awareness, planted like a marker in the places where your mind briefly lingers. When your focus shifts, so does it. Not by movement, but by knowing. Witnesses often describe a peculiar sensation just before seeing it again. The stillness of a room becomes too heavy. The air feels unbalanced, like gravity has shifted in one direction. It's rarely cold, like the chill associated with ghosts. Instead, it's quiet. Too quiet, as if sound itself is being dampened. And in that thick silence, the outline forms. One schoolteacher in rural Vermont described seeing it during lunch break, just outside the window of the staff room. It was midday, sunny. Children were playing on the field, and yet there was a figure's shadow stretching across the concrete wall outside, arms at its sides. head slightly lowered, lightly. There were no tall objects nearby, no people, no obstructions, just that shape. She blinked, and it was gone. But when she stood to leave, she saw it again. This time, in the hallway she'd just been walking toward. She said it didn't frighten her exactly. What scared her was how familiar it felt. As if it had always been around, she just hadn't been noticing. A presence not trying to scare or interact, but simply observe. And not from a distance either, from proximity, from habit, like it had been doing this a long time. That pattern kept surfacing in testimony. The moment people truly acknowledged the shadow, they began to feel as if it had always been there. Like it belonged in their story, quietly lingering in skipped moments and dim corners. People who'd spent years in the same house suddenly recalled a shadow on the stairs that never quite made sense. An outline in the laundry room. A shape they thought they imagined when they were children, now returning in adulthood. But the most disturbing part isn't its presence. It's what happens when you try to ignore it. Some people report that after resisting acknowledgement, after purposefully avoiding the places where it appears, their world begins to subtly adjust. Rooms feel smaller, reflections distort slightly, doorways seem to wait for them, as though anticipating when they'll finally enter. It's as if the shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It just waits with more intensity. It leans in closer to your daily life, pressing its silent attention into the fabric of your reality. And when it finally reappears, when you inevitably stop for 1 second too long, it's closer than ever. Right on the wall beside you, behind the glass of a dark screen, standing in the same corner where you left your coat the night before. That's when most people start to realize the truth. It was never about movement, it was about stillness, because the shadow does not chase, it does not warn, it waits. And the moment you stop moving long enough, it steps into the shape you've unknowingly left behind. There's something primal about the feeling of being watched. It crawls beneath the logic of your thoughts, anchoring itself in instincts far older than language. And when people describe the shadow, this shape that doesn't belong, what they mention most isn't what they see. It's what they feel. They feel it notice them. It's not aggressive, not cold, just aware. And that awareness feels heavy, like standing too close to a sleeping animal that might wake at any moment. You're not in danger, not yet. But every breath you take feels too loud. Every movement feels like a signal. That's why so many people, upon sensing the shadow nearby, refuse to turn around. Because what if it's not waiting behind you? What if it's beside you? A man in Bucharest tried to confront it. After weeks of glimpses and glances, he stood in the middle of his living room at night, turned off all the lights, and whispered, "I know you're there." According to his journal, which his sister later found, he turned around slowly. He didn't see anything, but he wrote that he felt something slip away. Not move, slip, like water down a drain. A presence that had been breathing on the edge of his reality, pulling back just before contact. He said the silence afterward was worse than any scream. Others who've turned around speak of strange after effects, not possession, not hallucination, but imbalance. Days feel off. Mirrors reflect the room correctly, but make the person inside seem slightly slower. Some people find their own shadows behaving strangely, appearing a second too late, bending in directions the light shouldn't permit. One woman described seeing her reflection blink before she did. Just once. Enough to know something wasn't right. She later remembered that she'd turned around the night before, convinced she saw a shadow behind her. Nothing had been there. But afterward, the house never quite felt like hers again. That's the paradox of the shadow. It does nothing, and yet it changes everything. It doesn't speak, but you hear it, in your hesitation, in the flicker of doubt before you enter a room, in the chill that runs down your spine when your own silhouette seems too still. The moment you face it, something shifts. Not externally, but within. A corner of your perception turns inward, permanently. You begin to notice the shapes around you a little more closely. You begin to see how often shadows appear without clear sources. And you wonder, how many of them are really yours? There's a theory that the shadow doesn't hurt you, that it doesn't need to. All it has to do is be witnessed, to be acknowledged. And in that act, it transfers something to you. A kind of awareness, a slight misalignment in your reality that grows over time. Not dramatically, but subtly. Like gravity pulling you toward a version of yourself that you were never meant to meet. And once that begins, there's no reversing it. Because the shadow isn't an entity, it's a condition. A state of presence that lingers once it's been felt. A doorway that doesn't open with keys, but with your stillness. So turn around if you must. But just know, what you don't see might still be seeing you. The mistake we make, the one we cling to out of fear, is believing the shadow is something that follows. That if we move fast enough, stay distracted long enough, we'll escape its reach. We convince ourselves it lingers behind us, trailing just out of sight. Something we can outpace with enough noise, enough light, enough denial. But the truth is far stranger, and far more unsettling. The shadow was never behind you. It was always ahead. Every pause you took, every doorway you hovered in, every stretch of silence where your mind wandered, those weren't moments it found you. Those were places it had already been. Waiting. Settled in the corners of rooms you hadn't yet entered, positioned in the quiet just before you arrived. Not moving with you, but anticipating you. That's what makes it different from a ghost, or a demon, or even a memory. It doesn't react. It doesn't need to. It simply appears in alignment with the parts of yourself you're trying not to acknowledge. The guilt you ignore, the thoughts you suppress, the stillness you avoid because you know what silence holds. This shadow doesn't want to be chased, or banished, or feared. It wants to be seen. And once you see it, truly see it, it becomes part of the landscape of your life. Not something that startles you, but something that lingers in the edge of your awareness. A shape that finds the places you pause, the moments you hesitate, the fragments of time when you are most alone with yourself. Because that's the real horror of it, isn't it? That it's not some external thing at all. It's a reflection. A placeholder for what's been building inside you. Fear, regret, unspoken truths. It takes shape not because it wants to harm you, but because you've given it shape through years of quiet avoidance. It does not feed on fear. It waits for honesty. And honesty only comes when everything else is still. So the next time you feel it, when the lights flicker, when the hallway feels longer than it should, when the shadow on the wall doesn't quite match the angle of your lamp, don't ask yourself what it wants. Ask yourself what part of you it belongs to. Because this was never a story about something following you. It's not about being watched, or haunted, or punished. It's about what finally catches up to you when you stop running. And when it does, you won't feel fear. You'll feel recognition.